Hello, my name is Tim Lawrence. I'm the Edexcel Psychology Subject Advisor, and this video is for the UK A-Level Psychology. It's part one of the presentation that we delivered for the live exam feedback event for paper one for the 2023 exam series. There'll be another video, part two of the paper one feedback, which will look at the extended response questions. This video, if I just move on to my agenda, is to give general feedback from the principal examiner on how paper one went this summer, and to look at some of the shorter answer questions that include AO3 skills and AO2 skills in particular, explain questions and scenario questions. So general points to consider from the paper one, what went well. So timing, it does remain a challenge for lots of candidates to fully answer all the questions on the paper. And so there were still some issues with the issues and debates section at the end, and we're taking feedback from centres on board about this and working on ways to improve candidate performance currently, candidate experience, I mean to say. But in general, the timing is something which candidates are getting better at, and there's fewer non-attempts, so that's a positive. Mathematical skills, the statistical calculations are being done significantly better than they were in the earlier exam series. So well done to lots of candidates there. It would be wise, though, for them to show working in case their final answer is incorrect. Some candidates missed out full marks for question 9b because they didn't read the instruction about decimal places. So that's something to look at. Taxonomy, which is the term examiners use for the command words sort of structure. So there's an improvement here in terms of candidates understanding what the demands of the questions are, and getting more credit because they're covering the correct assessment objectives. But to improve further, they need to make sure to look at the number of marks available, as this indicates how much detail and how many points they're going to need to achieve full marks. In terms of discuss questions, which have been challenging in the past, there's been a significant improvement there. There were questions 5 and 11 on this paper, and so candidates are understanding better that for discuss, they need to cover AO1 points and then AO2 application to the scenario with no evaluation or conclusion. And finally, logical chains of reasoning, which is something that the mark schemes look for the higher levels on the extended response questions. There were improvements here for evaluate and assess questions. So question 3, for example, there was good linking of the agentic state description to relevant evaluation points for AO3. And even where they wrote AO1 and AO3 separate, then candidates are doing better. So that's a perfectly reasonable way to answer those questions, as long as they link their AO3 clearly to the AO1 points that they've made. So those are all what went wells. Even better ifs for paper one. The depth of knowledge and understanding, although we talk a lot about AO3 being the most difficult skill, often candidates are losing out on the perhaps easier AO1 marks because they're not giving enough depth and detail to their AO1 knowledge, particularly on those extended response questions. So question 10, candidates often demonstrated clear knowledge and understanding of behavior shaping, but they were less able to show AO3 skills. That's a slightly different point about an area of the specification which teachers typically don't cover the evaluation for in as much depth. But remember that any of those evaluation points, like behavior shaping, could have a question assessing AO3 and looking for strengths and limitations of that explanation. So understanding the command word explain is a challenge for some students. So make sure that their answers to these shorter answer questions include AO3 justification. That's the real challenge. So whenever they see explain, it would be helpful if candidates knew that there was going to be a mark there for identifying or stating the relevant point, but then a second mark, which is the AO3 one for the justification. Or the exemplification is another good word that the examiners like to use. Then we have the extended response words needing equal development of both skills. This is an area for some centres to work on, I think. On paper one, the 8 markers and the 12 marker always have an equal split between AO1 and AO3, or AO2, AO1 and AO2, sorry, if it's a discuss question. So it's important that they give enough space and weight to AO1, for example, and don't just talk about strengths and limitations if it's an evaluate question. AO2 skills, the issue here, and it's a common one over the years, is that when candidates are required to apply, they can often make overly generic statements, especially regarding practical investigations. So many candidates, for example, whilst able to provide strengths for question 4b and an improvement for 4c, did not make these specifically relevant to the cognitive practical, which is what the question was asking them to do. Often they relied on generalizability to a sample, which could have been relevant, but the way they've written it often could have applied to any of the practicals that they've looked at within the specification. So they need to make it specific to that one in some way to get marked. So more practice on those types of question where students are being required to apply a point to a particular practical is a piece of advice from the examiner. And a final one, which is just about general exam technique for all subjects, is making sure that they write in the correct space on the answer paper. So using white space, answering earlier questions on the last few pages of essay line space, using the blank pages to answer questions, all are highly problematic because it's very difficult when their papers get scanned in a big factory in the north of England to make sure that the right bits of their responses are finding their way to the correct examiners through the electronic marking system. So it's worth explaining that to students. I think it's a point we made last year. They'll be less likely to write on a bit of a blank page if they understand their physical paper is not being marked by one examiner in the way that their mock exams are being marked by their teachers. If they don't write it in the right place, or clearly indicate which question they're answering on the extra paper at the back of the booklet, then there's a significant danger that then work won't get marked at all. Okay, on to the shorter answer questions then. As I said, you will be able to download these in the from a link in the video description. And we're going to start by looking at question 1c. Explain one weakness of the study by Sharif et al. In terms of reliability. Now, for each of these questions, and that's a 2-mark question, for each of these questions, I'll give a little bit of kind of general feedback that doesn't relate to these exemplars. And at some point in that, if you'd like to then read it carefully on screen or using the downloaded responses, which are the same as these, then you can pause the video to do that. I won't pause for long, just enough to let you hit the pause button. So this required AO1 and AO3 skills. The AO1 is to identify the weakness of the classic study, demonstrating where this could have taken place in this particular example. The AO3 skill requires justification to explain why this is a weakness for the reliability of the study, such as the impact it could have on findings. It's important candidates know the different terminology for evaluating studies and understand why these terms are strengths and weaknesses for research. Also, candidates need to make sure they do not confuse validity with reliability, because that was quite common in weaker responses. Where candidates didn't score marks, this tended to be due to not focusing on reliability in their answers. So pause if you'd like to have a look at this before we look at the examiner feedback. Okay, so highlighting here is to show where AO1 and AO3 credit has been given, excuse me. And the yellow is for AO1 and the green is for AO3. And both of these responses score 2 out of 2 because they're good examples of identification of the issue and then justification of why it might have an impact on reliability specifically. So moving on to question 4b, this is explain 2 strengths of your cognitive psychology practical investigation. So this one is asking for AO2, which is showing application to the particular practical, and then AO3 again, because it's an explain question. The second mark for each of these is AO3 for justification of why it's a strength. So the answer needs to be contextualized. It needs to be applied to the cognitive practical specifically, as we mentioned in the general feedback for this paper. And they must be referring to a practical which has followed the research method that has been set out in the specification. So again, I'll give you a second to pause if you want to. And then this response A to 4B has scored 4 out of 4. Again, the yellow shows where this time it's the AO2 mark has been credited, and the green, the AO3. The identification of the standardized procedure is specific and relevant to the cognitive practical. The justification point demonstrates good understanding of why standardization had a positive impact. And for the second point, the first point about control is not specific to the practical investigation. The justification then makes it apparent. So if you were hesitant over that, they've been given both marks for the second one as well, because it's been made clear in the justification why that is specific. So we have another response to this same question. Pause if you would like to. And then I'm moving the slide on. There's no highlighting appearing, and that's because there's no marks awarded for this one. This got 0 out of 4. So the first point is too vague. When using standardization as a strength, candidates need to be specific to demonstrate how the procedure is standardized. This response doesn't do this. It simply states features that were the same without giving those necessary details. The second point is a generic one. Candidates are choosing to use generalizability, and whilst I can gain credit, many are not getting credit, as in this case, because the specific contextualization isn't there. The evaluation could be for any of the 6 practicals that come up in the specification, so therefore it's not credit worthy. Okay, question 4C. Explain one improvement you could have made to your cognitive psychology practical investigation. So this is about how to improve. AO2 for an improvement that is contextualized, that is relevant to the particular study, and AO3 again to credit justification. Yeah, so let's have a look in a second at the marks that were given to this particular response. Some candidates achieved at least 1 mark here, but a number achieved 0 because they did not give an improvement, often giving a weakness. So good point about just reading the question carefully there. Many candidates gave generic responses to this question with no link to the cognitive psychology practical. So they're really good questions to practice in terms of boosting your students' exam performance. This is a pretty good one, but as you can perhaps see from the highlighting, the justification mark is only given for the second point there. So 1 mark for response A, because they get the identification of the improvement, such as changing the design and giving specific information of how this will be carried out. The justification is not enough, though, for that response A. It does not specify the impact of reducing order effects and which order effects would be reduced. Whereas response B does get both marks because the positive impact the improvement would have has been fully explained. So one final question for this part 1 of paper 1 feedback, and it's this one, which was found to be quite difficult by candidates. Responses need to explain how shaping would be successful and not successful in making the boy sit on the chair. Therefore, examiners need to ensure that the AO2 is present and linked to behavior shaping as well. So generic answers score 0, and just mentioning the boy or marigold, as we've discussed before, is not enough for AO2 credit. They need to have engaged more with the scenario. I think it's a good good bit of exam technique to look at with students is giving short quotes from the scenario. A common problem is a common mistake is to copy large chunks of the scenario out, and they won't get credit for that. But short quotes showing how the scenario illustrates aspects of the theory are a really good idea. So many candidates were unfamiliar with the concept of behavior shaping and therefore found this difficult. Um, where candidates did have knowledge of it, they would often describe how this would be used in the scenario or give generic assertions about its success. Where credit was given, though, it was for AO2 application of strengths and weaknesses, such as explaining that behavior shaping is more ethical and using weaknesses such as it being time consuming or a form of social control. Candidates overall found it difficult to provide AO3 justifications in understanding the impact a strength or weakness would have. So it's important that they are knowledgeable about all aspects of the specification, and they should not be able to not only demonstrate knowledge, but also to understand strengths and weaknesses of all of those points. So pause if you would like to read this and consider what mark you give it. This is out of 4. And here we have the AO2 in yellow and the AO3 highlighted in green. This gets 4 out of 4. So the identification mark for the strength, understanding that behavior shaping is ethical because it's a gradual process. And then the justification is, again, it's linked to the context, and it has those points about it not being abrupt, easing him into it, building rapport, and really showing understanding of why it could be successful. So the weakness, time consuming, again, is relevant to the scenario, and the justification mark for why it might not work due to the practical limitations for Marigold and the whole class to look after is a good link to the sort of meaningful link to the context. Okay, and then we've got one more answer to this question here. And this one, moving on to look at the marks, gets 1 mark for each, but it doesn't get the AO3 marks, just the AO2. So for the strength, 1 mark for identification. They're easy small steps. Nothing there to justify why small steps are necessarily better than big steps. For the weakness, 1 mark for identifying it's time consuming, and the example is linked to the scenario. So that's definitely good AO2. But they could have gone on to justify that by linking to less useful, to it being less useful because other children could be disadvantaged as a result of Marigold's time being taken up, or something of that type. So that concludes part 1. As I mentioned, part 2, looking at some of the extended response questions, will be in this same playlist. Those are my contact details. Thanks very much for watching part 1.